The desert wind howled across the endless sands of North Africa, carrying with it the scent of oil, sweat, and fear. It was June 1942, and the Afrika Korps, once the pride of Hitler's Wehrmacht, was battered, exhausted, and on the brink of collapse. At the center of this storm stood one man, General Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, a commander whose name inspired both terror and respect on both sides of the war. But on this day, Rommel faced a choice that would define not just his career, but his very soul. Would he obey Hitler's direct orders to fight to the last man, or would he risk everything, his reputation, his command, even his life, to save his own men from certain destruction? Rommel's rise to fame had been meteoric. He was a soldier's general, a man who led from the front, who ate the same rations as his men and shared their dangers. His tactics in the desert had become legendary: lightning-fast attacks, daring flanking maneuvers, and a knack for turning defeat into victory. But now, the tide was turning. The British Eighth Army, under the relentless command of General Bernard Montgomery, was pushing hard, and Rommel's forces were running out of everything: fuel, ammunition, and hope. The orders from Berlin were clear and uncompromising. No retreat, Hitler had commanded. The Afrika Korps will hold its ground at all costs. For Rommel, the words were a death sentence. He knew the reality on the ground. His tanks were running on fumes, his men were exhausted, and the British were closing in from all sides. To stand and fight would mean annihilation. But to disobey Hitler was to risk court-martial, disgrace, and possibly execution. Rommel paced his command tent, the weight of the decision pressing down on him like the desert sun. Outside, the sounds of battle echoed across the dunes: artillery shells whistling, machine guns chattering, the distant rumble of tanks. His staff officers watched him anxiously, waiting for a decision. "We cannot hold much longer," one whispered. "If we stay, we die." The radio crackled with another message from Berlin. This time, the voice was colder, more insistent. "You are to stand fast. No withdrawal. The Führer expects victory." Rommel clenched his fists, his jaw set. He had seen too many good men die for nothing. He would not let it happen again. But what would the cost be if he defied the most powerful man in Germany? As the sun set over the desert, Rommel gathered his senior officers. The tension in the room was electric. Maps were spread across the table, marked with red and blue arrows, each one representing lives at stake. "Gentlemen," Rommel began, his voice steady but grim, "we are outnumbered, outgunned, and out of time. Berlin orders us to hold. But I will not sacrifice this army for a lost cause. We will withdraw, on my command." The officers exchanged glances, some relieved, others fearful. They knew what this meant. Disobeying Hitler was not just a military decision, it was an act of rebellion. But Rommel's authority was absolute in the desert, and his men trusted him with their lives. "Prepare the withdrawal," he ordered. "We move at dawn." That night, Rommel sat alone, staring at the flickering lantern on his desk. He thought of his family back in Germany, of the men sleeping in the sand outside, of the thousands of lives that hung in the balance. He knew the Gestapo would be watching. He knew that one wrong move could mean the end, not just for him, but for everyone he commanded. But he also knew that to obey Hitler now would be to betray everything he believed in as a soldier and a leader. As dawn broke, the Afrika Korps began its retreat. It was a desperate, chaotic maneuver, carried out under the constant threat of British attack. Trucks and tanks roared across the sand, kicking up clouds of dust. Wounded men were loaded onto makeshift ambulances, while engineers laid mines and set charges to slow the enemy's advance. Rommel rode at the front, his eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of pursuit. The British, sensing victory, pressed hard. Artillery shells exploded all around, sending shrapnel whistling through the air. Rommel's men fought a running battle, holding off the enemy just long enough to escape. It was a masterclass in tactical withdrawal, disciplined, organized, and ruthless. But every mile gained was paid for in blood. Back in Berlin, the news of Rommel's retreat hit Hitler like a thunderbolt. The Führer was furious. He raged at his generals, demanding explanations, threatening reprisals. "Rommel is a coward!" he shouted. "He has betrayed the Reich!" But even as Hitler fumed, reports from the front made it clear: the Afrika Korps was battered, but not destroyed. Rommel's decision had saved thousands of lives. For the men of the Afrika Korps, the retreat was both a relief and a humiliation. They had fought bravely, but now they were on the run, pursued by an enemy that seemed to grow stronger with every passing day. Morale was low, supplies were dwindling, and the desert itself became an enemy. Sandstorms, heatstroke, and thirst claimed as many lives as the British guns. Rommel knew that the battle was far from over. He worked tirelessly to reorganize his forces, to find new sources of fuel and ammunition, to inspire his men to keep fighting. He sent urgent messages to Berlin, pleading for reinforcements, for supplies, for anything that could turn the tide. But the answers were always the same. Hold your ground. No retreat. Victory or death. The pressure mounted with every passing day. Rommel's health began to fail. He suffered from exhaustion, from stomach pains, from the constant stress of command. But he refused to give in. He drove himself harder, pushing his men to the limit, always searching for a way to outmaneuver the enemy. "We will not go quietly into the night," he told his staff. "We will fight, and we will survive." But the British were relentless. Montgomery's 8th Army launched a series of devastating attacks, driving the Afrika Korps back, mile by mile, across the burning sands. Rommel's men fought with courage and skill, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. The retreat became a rout, and soon the Afrika Korps was trapped against the sea, with nowhere left to run in Berlin. Hitler's anger turned to paranoia. He sent his most trusted officers to North Africa, demanding that Rommel be brought to heel. The Gestapo began to monitor Rommel's every move, searching for evidence of disloyalty. Rommel knew that he was walking a razor's edge. One misstep, one careless word, and he could find himself facing a firing squad. But Rommel refused to back down. He continued to put the lives of his men above the demands of the regime. He ordered his officers to avoid unnecessary engagements, to conserve their strength, to retreat when necessary. "Our duty is to our soldiers," he told them, "not to the fantasies of politicians." The final showdown came at El Alamein. The British launched a massive assault, throwing everything they had at the battered Afrika Korps. Rommel's men fought with desperate courage, but the outcome was never in doubt. The lines broke, and the retreat became a desperate fight for survival. Rommel knew that the end was near. He sent a final message to Berlin, pleading for permission to withdraw, to save what was left of his army. The answer was swift and brutal. "No retreat. Stand and die." Rommel stared at the message, his hands trembling with rage. He knew what he had to do. He gathered his officers one last time. "We have done our duty," he said quietly. "Now we must save our men." The decision was made. The Afrika Korps would break out, would fight its way to safety, no matter what Berlin said. The breakout was a nightmare. British tanks and aircraft pounded the retreating columns, turning the desert into a killing field. Rommel rode at the front, urging his men on, refusing to leave anyone behind. "Keep moving!" he shouted. "We will not die here!" The cost was staggering. Hundreds of men were killed or captured, and the Afrika Korps was shattered as a fighting force. But thanks to Rommel's leadership, thousands survived to fight another day. It was a bitter victory, won at a terrible price. In the aftermath, Rommel faced the wrath of Hitler. He was summoned to Berlin, interrogated by the Gestapo, accused of cowardice and treason. But Rommel stood his ground. "I did what was necessary to save my men," he said. "I will not apologize for that." Hitler, furious but unable to replace his best general, sent Rommel back to the front. But the relationship was broken. Rommel knew that he was living on borrowed time, that the regime no longer trusted him. He became more cautious, more guarded, always watching his back. But for the men who served under him, Rommel's defiance became a legend. They spoke of his courage, his compassion, his willingness to risk everything for their sake. "He was the only one who cared about us," one veteran recalled. He was a real leader. As the war dragged on, Rommel's reputation grew. He became a symbol of resistance, not just to the Allies, but to his own men. He was the general who dared to say no, who put the lives of his soldiers above the demands of a man. But the cost of defiance was high. The Gestapo continued to watch him, to search for evidence of disloyalty. Rommel knew that he was a marked man, that sooner or later the regime would come for him. But he refused to be intimidated. "I will do my duty," he told his wife. "No matter the cost." The war in North Africa ended in defeat. The Afrika Korps was destroyed, and Rommel was recalled to Europe. But his legend lived on. He was sent to France, to prepare the defenses against the coming Allied invasion. Once again, he found himself at odds with Hitler, who demanded that every inch of ground be held, no matter the cost. Rommel argued for flexibility, for the ability to retreat and regroup, to fight another day. But Hitler would not listen. The pattern repeated itself: orders from Berlin, defiance from Rommel, the lives of his men hanging in the balance. As D-Day approached, Rommel worked tirelessly to strengthen the Atlantic Wall, to prepare his men for the coming storm. He knew that the invasion would be the greatest test of his career, that the fate of Europe hung in the balance. But he also knew that he could not trust the orders from Berlin. When the Allies landed in Normandy, Rommel's fears were realized. The German defenses were overwhelmed, and the front began to collapse. Once again, Rommel faced the same terrible choice: obey orders and sacrifice his men, or defy Berlin and try to save what he could. He chose his men. He ordered withdrawals, regroupings, tactical retreats, anything to avoid the slaughter that Hitler demanded. His officers followed him, trusting his judgment, knowing that he would do everything in his power to keep them alive. But the Gestapo was watching. Reports of Rommel's defiance reached Berlin, and Hitler's patience finally snapped. Rommel was implicated in the July 20th plot to assassinate Hitler, though the evidence was thin. It didn't matter. The regime had found its excuse. On October 14, 1944, Rommel was given a choice: suicide, or a show trial that would destroy his family. He chose death, swallowing a cyanide capsule in his own home. The news was reported as a hero's death, but the truth was darker: a final act of defiance against a regime he could no longer serve. Rommel's legacy is complicated. He was a brilliant general, a master of tactics, a leader who inspired loyalty and respect. But he was also a man caught between duty and conscience, between the demands of a dictator and the lives of his men. His defiance of Hitler was both an act of courage and a desperate gamble, one that saved thousands but cost him everything. The story of Rommel's defiance is not just a tale of war. It is a story of leadership, of sacrifice, of the terrible choices that come with command. It is a reminder that even in the darkest times, there are those who will risk everything for the sake of others. As we look back on the deserts of North Africa, on the beaches of Normandy, on the final, tragic days of Rommel's life, we are left with a question: what does it mean to be a leader? Is it obedience, or is it the courage to say no when the cost is too high? For Rommel, the answer was clear. He chose his men. He chose humanity over blind obedience, compassion over cruelty, sacrifice over self-preservation. And in doing so, he became more than just a general. He became a symbol of what is possible when one man dares to defy the darkness. The lessons of Rommel's life echo through history. They remind us that leadership is not about power, but about responsibility. That true courage is not found in following orders, but in standing up for what is right. That the greatest victories are not always won on the battlefield, but in the choices we make when everything is on the line. In the end, Rommel's story is a testament to the power of conscience, to the strength of the human spirit, to the enduring hope that even in the face of tyranny, there are those who will choose to save lives rather than destroy them. It is a story that belongs not just to the past, but to all of us, here and now. So the next time you hear the name Rommel, remember not just the Desert Fox, the master tactician, the legend of the Afrika Korps. Remember the man who dared to defy, who risked everything for the sake of his men, who showed the world that even in the darkest hour, there is always a choice. And that, perhaps, is the greatest victory of all: But the story doesn't end there. The men who survived because of Rommel's decisions carried his legacy with them, long after the guns fell silent. They spoke of his courage, his humanity, his willingness to put their lives above his own safety. For them, Rommel was not just a general, he was a savior. Historians have debated Rommel's actions for decades. Some see him as a hero, others as a flawed man caught in an impossible situation. But all agree on one thing: his defiance changed the course of the war, and saved countless lives. The documents that have emerged since the war, declassified orders, personal letters, eyewitness accounts, paint a picture of a man under unimaginable pressure, forced to make choices that no one should ever have to make. They show a leader who was willing to risk everything, not for glory, but for the men who followed him. Rommel's story is a warning, too. It reminds us of the dangers of blind obedience, of the terrible cost of war, of the need for leaders who are willing to stand up for what is right, even when it means defying those in power. As we remember the battles of North Africa, the desperate retreats, the final, tragic days of Rommel's life, we are reminded that history is not just a series of dates and events. It is the story of people, real, flawed, courageous people, who faced impossible choices, and who, in the end, chose to do what was right. Rommel's defiance was not just an act of rebellion. It was an act of humanity, a refusal to sacrifice lives for the sake of pride or ideology. It was a reminder that even in the darkest times, there is always hope, always a chance to choose compassion over cruelty, life over death, and that is the true legacy of Erwin Rommel. Not the battles he won or lost, not the medals or the titles, but the lives he saved, the courage he showed, the example he set for all who would come after him. In the end, Rommel's story is our story, a story of struggle, of sacrifice, of the enduring power of conscience. It is a story that challenges us to ask ourselves, what would we do if faced with the same choice? Would we have the courage to defy? To stand up, to save lives, no matter the cost? That is the question that echoes through history, that haunts the deserts of North Africa, the beaches of Normandy, the quiet rooms where decisions are made and lives hang in the balance. It is a question that each of us must answer, in our own way, in our own time. For Rommel, the answer was clear. He chose his men. He chose to save lives, to defy orders, to risk everything for the sake of those who trusted him. And in doing so, he became more than just a general. He became a symbol of hope, of courage, of the enduring power of the human spirit. So let us remember Rommel, not just as the desert fox, but as a man who dared to choose compassion over cruelty, humanity over obedience, life over death. Let us remember his example, and strive to live up to it, in our own lives, in our own time. Because in the end, that is what matters most, not the battles we fight, but the choices we make, the lives we touch, the courage we show when everything is on the line. That is the true measure of a leader, the true legacy of Erwin Rommel, and the lesson that will endure long after the last shot is fired, the last order given, the last battle lost or won.